The use of saunas is exploding here in the U.S., but they've been standard in other parts of the world for a long time. Finland's a great example, with more than one sauna for every 2 people. Let me say that again. 1 sauna for every 2 people. What is it about the health, well-being, and high-performance benefits that are driving this kind of engagement? Is it a fad? Or is the trend driven by dependable evidence? What frequency, duration, and temperature are recommended for better health and well-being? How about for athletic performance or recovery? What's the difference between infrared and traditional saunas? Are the needs of men different than the needs of women when it comes to saunas? Today's guest, Dr. Daniel Gagnon, is a thermal physiologist who has been studying the effects of heat exposure on human health and performance for over 2 decades. He is an associate professor at the University of Montreal and researcher at the Montreal Health Institute. If you've been curious about the evidence, what it's saying about saunas, you've come to the right place. If you're new to the podcast, I'm Dr. Brad Cooper, your host and CEO of Catalyst Coaching, the nation's top-rated MBHWC-approved health, wellness, and performance coaching institute. We've been training coaches since 2007. So if you've been thinking about pursuing certification, or maybe you're already a coach looking for a strong community, we're here for you. Reach out anytime with questions. Results at catalystcoachinginstitute.com. Again, that's results at catalystcoachinginstitute.com. And if you're looking to integrate coaching into your organization or your life, our Catalyst One coaching may be precisely what you've been seeking. All the details at catalystcoaching360.com/one. Or feel free to reach out to us via that same email, results at catalystcoachinginstitute.com. And now, it's time to heat things up with Dr. Daniel Gagnon on the latest episode of the Coaching Lab podcast. All right, Dan, well, welcome to the show. Really excited to have you on here. This is such a hot topic now, and you're the guy, so thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Let's start with the basics. What is actually happening inside the body during sauna exposure? Physiologically, neurologically, what makes it so powerful? And we're going to bounce back and forth between kind of recovery, health and well-being, and endurance performance. So for now, maybe just the recovery side and that type of response.
Yeah, so I think it's always good to go back to the beginning. So obviously when we're exposed to heat, whether it's sauna or any other form of heat, our body is made to defend our internal body temperature. So it tries to at least minimize changes in internal body temperature. And to do that, it activates responses, the 2 primary ones being sweating and also sending blood to the skin surface. So to do that, it vasodilates the skin blood vessels, so the blood vessels open up. And especially the vasodilation of the blood vessels, what it does is that when we're essentially not hot, there's little to no blood that goes to the skin. It's not really a metabolically active organ. And then all of a sudden the body says, hey, we need to send a whole bunch of blood there to lose heat. So the body is kind of faced with a bit of a challenge. And it's really a cardiovascular challenge. So the heart has to beat faster. It beats a bit stronger. It also takes blood away from certain organs that can, reduce their blood flow. So the gut, the kidneys, and it tries to send as much as it can to the skin to try and facilitate heat exchange with the environment. And that really, so if we're just exposed to heat, doing nothing, just lying there, I mean, in younger, healthy adults, we can see heart rates going up from 40, 50 beats per minute to easily 100 beats per minute. So it's already a bit of a doubling. And that's just the fact that, the heart has to pump blood to all the organs that still need blood and oxygen while trying to send some to the skin. And if we're hot and we're sweating and we don't replace that sweat with fluids, then we can also become dehydrated. Sweat is 99.9% water, so we lose our body fluids. And if we don't replace that, well, then that can also make the cardiovascular responses even greater because we have a little bit of less of blood volume, and that itself can increase the work of the heart. So the way I like to see it is that, it's basically like a very mild form of exercise when you think about it. It's going for a very light walk. Our heart rate goes up, blood flow is circulating, and our body temperature is elevated. So I think that's really where all the potential adaptations we'll discuss start from.
Okay. There's so many ways we can go in this. So how does it differ from exercise-induced heat? So you mentioned it's similar to a walk. So let's say I'm in Texas somewhere. We're in Colorado, but let's say I'm in Texas somewhere. It's a hot day. I go out for a nice 30-minute walk in 85-degree temperature versus stepping into the sauna at 180 or something. And we'll talk about those temperatures later. But how does, obviously, there's many things going on with the walk that aren't happening with the sauna, but how do those compare, contrast, overlap, that kind of thing?
Yeah, so the first thing is obviously the heat source. So we, as humans, we're metabolically active all the time. So we have our basal metabolic rate. And really what that is heat generation in the end. So when we say we have a basal metabolic rate of, so many thousand kilocalories in a day, well, in the end, that's so many thousand kilocalories that we lose in the form of heat. And so when we do exercise, we increase our metabolic rate. So we go from, 300 kilocalories per hour to whatever it might be with the intensity that we're doing. So we're generating a lot more heat internally from metabolism from the skeletal muscles. And then, so it's an internal heat generation that then has to be evacuated to the surface to minimize changes in body temperature. So if we go now in a hot environment, what happens is that, especially if air temperature is greater than our skin temperature. So, and I apologize for the listeners, I'm Canadian.
That's
so I work
okay.
in degrees Celsius, so we can do the conversions
That's
afterwards.
totally fine.
But our skin temperature is around 32-ish degrees Celsius. That's got to be around 90-ish Fahrenheit.
Yeah, I think 98.6 for...
Exactly. So anytime air temperature goes above that, we're actually going to gain heat from the environment. So there's heat that's going to be forced inside the body. And with time, we can accumulate a little bit of heat, and not forgetting that we're generating heat anyways from metabolism. So the body then has to try and evacuate a bit more heat than it does. And it just becomes a bit harder for the heat to be evacuated if we're in a hot environment, and especially if we're in a humid environment. So our main mechanism to lose heat is the evaporation of sweat. So we often think of sweating as something that's socially kind of uncomfortable, awkward, but really it's very important. We need it. That's the main way we lose heat. So if the sweat can evaporate, then we tend to accumulate a little bit more heat inside the body. So those are the main two differences. We either with exercise generate heat from the inside, or if we're in a hot environment, we can gain heat from the environment, and it also makes it just a bit harder to get rid of the heat that we're generating anyways. So those are the two main differences. The other thing, obviously, is if we're just passive, just sitting, for example, in a hot environment, we don't have any muscular contractions that we would have with exercise. And obviously that could create different physiological adaptations over the long term.
Now I'm thinking about, well, let's go ahead and jump into temperatures. So the one that I've been using, we have a home unit we've put in, and it's generally 180 degrees. But I'm going to change that based on our conversation today because I'm curious what the data is talking about. But just using that number as a baseline, you're never in 180 degrees outside. If you're at 90, it feels hot. Obviously, humidity has a big influence on that. Let's change my question. Now you go for a walk. It's a nice cool day, so you're not in the heat. How does that cool day, easy pace walk compare to a higher temperature sauna sit?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I think it all comes back down to the stimulus. So what's actually how the body is going to respond to the stimulus. So if we go, let's say, for a nice, easy walk outside in a cool environment, maybe our heart rate gets up to 100 beats per minute. We have some muscular contractions. We're obviously using energy. So there's an energy expenditure going on. And maybe when we're sitting in a hot room, we may have the same increase in heart rate because it's very, very hot. And our body, and I think it's a good intro to say that our bodies are very good at defending internal body temperature. So to come back to your question, like if we want to have physiological responses happen by sitting, especially in hot air, that air needs to be very, very hot for it to do anything to our body, really, because if not, it's going to be too efficient, and the physiological responses will be relatively minor. To get back to your question is, I think it's just that we have to maximize the stimulus based on the environment that we're in. So if we're exercising, we generate a lot of heat internally because generally we're very inefficient at performing external mechanical work. So we may need less of an external stimulus, so air temperature, to get very hot. But if we're just kind of passive resting, we're not generating as much heat. We're just generating our normal basal metabolic rate. And then we need a lot of heat stimulus to kind of stress the system and make it respond. So I think, to go back to your question, if especially in a sauna, it needs to be very hot if we want the body to respond and to cause physiological responses that could induce adaptations that are either beneficial for health, well-being, or performance in the long run.
Let's take the person who they're listening and they're saying, okay, I have a nice exercise routine. I'm doing 150 minutes a week, 3 times a week or 4 times a week. And I'm debating, should I spend an extra 20, 30 minutes in the sauna 2, 3 times a week? Or should I increase that 150 minutes to 220 or whatever? What would be your thoughts around that? Not for the athlete, not for the performance piece, but for the general health and well-being over the long term. And if the answer differs based on age or gender, I'd love to hear that too.
Yeah. So this is obviously my exercise science bias. I think if we should do something, it should be exercise for sure. So if somebody is doing already 150 minutes of exercise per week, that is amazing. Keep doing it. I don't think there's any need to replace necessarily with, for example, sauna. If there's an interest, though, I don't, why not? I think the sauna, I see it more as a complementary thing. So if we're already active and we want to use the sauna, especially for, we just relaxation purposes, we just enjoy the feeling of warmth, I think that there's nothing wrong to add it. I think at this stage, though, I don't think we're at the point where we can say we should replace exercise for heat exposure. Now, there's maybe certain conditions indeed where, for whatever reason, people do not meet exercise guidelines because they cannot, because they don't want to, because they don't like exercise, whatever reason it may be, then it could become a potential alternative. Another situation is, we could try to do maybe a bit less of exercise and then combine it with some form of heat exposure as well. But I think that the ideal goal is to be physically active first. And then if for whatever reason we can't, then we can obviously integrate some heat exposure in there. So that would be my general advice, I guess, for non-performance related scenarios. But again, from what I've seen anyways, there's no harm either in doing sauna or whatever form of heat exposure or heat therapy. So if people are curious and they want to just try it and see if they like it, why not? And if it does good for them, then I think that's also just another way to improve their well-being.
So with that 150 as our baseline number, if that person's already 3 times a week, 50 minutes or whatever that comes to, and now they're on the fence. So we're not replacing the 150. We're not dropping that to 120, but we're saying, should I take my 150 to 250, or would I be better off holding 150 and adding 3 20-minute saunas sessions, something like that?
Yeah, so I think we generally know that if we add a duration of exercise or duration of physical activity, we keep accumulating benefits for health and well-being. So I think there is definitely an advantage to increasing, let's say, to 200 or 250 minutes. I think that should be the first goal. To my knowledge, we don't know whether we could, if somebody already does 150 and we add, let's say, I don't know, 30 to 60 minutes a week of heat exposure, would that have a same or different effect? We just don't know.
Okay.
So I think if people are willing to do it and they can and they're motivated, option one would be to increase their duration of physical activity. If 150 is already enough, which is already great, and they're not necessarily willing or capable of increasing anymore, but they would have time to, include sauna or whatever else, then why not? That would be a nice way to complement the benefits that they're already getting from exercising.
Okay. And then on the performance side, I was just reading Connor Mance, the American marathon record holder, is pretty vocal about the fact that he's integrating sauna sessions into his runs. I believe he tends to do them immediately after his workouts or sometime in that window. What are some of the most underappreciated benefits of regular sauna use for endurance athletes, the triathletes, the runners, cyclists, outside of heat adaptation? And Connor was preparing for a hot race for that one, but I think he's using it in general as well. What are some thoughts along those lines?
Yeah, so this is a field that's really, I think the word is very appropriate, a hot topic. So for sure, there are benefits to using heat for performance in a hot environment, like you mentioned. So I don't think there's any doubt about that. If we expose ourselves to heat, we're going to better perform and deal with the heat. So I think that's a given. We can put that aside. Where it becomes a bit more gray is whether using heat to improve performance in temperate environments, in non-hot environments. There's evidence both for and against it. And really, when I say against it, it's actually not negative. It's just that there's no effect of adding heat. So at least we can start from the premise that it's probably not going to do anything negative. Now, the question is whether it's going to do something positive. And I think it really depends of when we do it and how we do it. So you mentioned doing it after exercise. That's kind of the trend I've seen in the research as of late, is really trying to complement quote unquote normal exercise training with adding heat to our routines. And that's been done a lot in the form of post-exercise hot water immersion or post-exercise sauna. The evidence seems a bit clearer for post-exercise hot water immersion, less so for sauna. And that might just be the fact that it's relatively new. There's not a whole lot of research that's been done. So maybe as evidence accumulates, maybe we'll just have a clearer picture of it. And you can also think of, the difference between hot water immersion and sauna. I mean, it's completely different, really. When we're in water, the stimulus to heat our body is much stronger. So the heat exchange between the body and water is much more efficient than it is between the body and air. So we can have a temperature of, 40 degrees Celsius in hot water, and within 30 minutes, we would be very, very hot. Whereas if we did that 40 degrees Celsius air temperature, I mean, it's obviously maybe not comfortable, but our body would tolerate that very well, and we wouldn't be very hot. So, and on top of that, with the water causes it pushes against our body. It causes hydrostatic pressure, and that itself could induce adaptations that we don't get if we just sit in a hot environment. So I think it all comes down to basically the frequency, just like exercise training, frequency, intensity, and duration. And as long as we do it where we feel like we're causing physiological responses inside our body, then at least there's the theoretical foundation that it could help us perform in a temperate environment. So I always try to look at it more from a practical point of view and then a scientific point of view. From a practical point of view, if people do it and they feel like it's beneficial, then there's no reason really not to do it. Unless it's really compromising their normal training activity, or it's adding, for example, I know sometimes studies use, for example, additional exercise sessions, but done in the heat, then maybe we could overtrain and that might not be a good thing in the end. But if we do it more in a passive way after our usual exercise routines, I haven't seen really any evidence that it would necessarily be bad. So if it feels good and people feel like it helps them, why not? And I would just invite everybody to just consider, obviously, the differences between hot water immersion and sauna, and to adjust their exposure accordingly based on whatever form of heat exposure they want to use.
And any suggestions as far as feedback loops they could use, say HRV, resting heart rate, a shifting of the zones when they are on the bike or the run at a certain pace where they're noticing. Are there many studies on that of, okay, this runner, triathlete, whatever, started using sauna, and over 3 months, their pace, a 7-minute mile pace, went from 128 beats per minute to 123. Does that data exist? Is it in process? What do we know about that piece?
Yeah, so for now, if we could have data over 3 months, that would be amazing. We're more on a time scale of weeks. So studies that have used maybe from a couple weeks all the way up to maybe 7 to 10 weeks ish. That would probably be the longest I could think of off the top of my head. I guess for people to try and see if it's actually doing something beneficial, there's probably for sure the heart rate response. So if their heart rate, if they kind of notice that their heart rate at rest is decreasing, that's usually a sign of blood volume expansion. So more blood volume, which is a known adaptation to heat exposure. That could be one sign that potentially, it's enough and it's doing something for them. And that could translate into a lower heart rate at a given exercise intensity. So that would be a second indication to look for. Also, if they feel like they're sweating more, and that may not be necessarily like it may not be associated with a good thing, but at least it means that there's some sort of heat adaptation or acclimation that is occurring, and we're confident that our stimulus of heat exposure is sufficient to at least cause that response. And the last thing I would potentially add is also perception. So obviously when we exercise, even in a temperate environment, and especially in a performance setting, athletes are going to generate a lot of heat, and the body becomes very efficient at dealing with that and losing it or exchanging it with the environment. But still, we can have the perception of like, okay, I'm exercising, it's hard, it just feels hot. And with heat acclimation, we know that our perception to heat can be improved. So if what we felt was kind of hard, but in a sense of like, I feel hot, I'm generating a lot of heat, I'm obviously able to continue. But if that sensation kind of decreases a little bit, that's also potentially another sign that we're acclimating to the sauna or hot water that we're using on a regular basis.
So several points off of that. You mentioned plasma volume expansion, sweat response, even in temperate environments. As I'm hearing you say that, I'm thinking, oh, well, that'd be great, and that'd be helpful. So even for the non-marathon or Ironman type stuff, even a 10K in 60-degree weather, it seems like the things you're mentioning would be significant. Because the difference, we're so excited about super shoes providing a 3% difference. Certainly blood plasma levels, more rapid cooling would have a similar response.
Yeah, and that's the whole basis actually for using heat acclimation in a non-hot environment. So just if we go back historically, heat acclimation has been really used to induce those adaptations to better work and perform in the heat. And we know for a fact that if we heat acclimate, well, we have an increase in plasma volume. We are more efficient at losing heat. We perceive the heat better. So we just perform better in the heat. And towards the end of the year 2000s, beginning 2010s, then people started saying, well, if we can induce those adaptations, same as your comment, that should be good also for exercise in temperate environments. So, and some studies have shown evidence of that if we can at least heat acclimate to a sufficient extent where we get blood plasma volume expansion, where we improve our heat loss capacity, where we decrease our perceptions in the heat, there's some evidence that can translate into temperate environments. Now, again, at least initially, we can kind of classify those studies as maybe proof of concepts. They did 7 or 10 consecutive days of relatively intense heat acclimation protocols. And what I like is since then, a lot of studies have tried to make it a bit more practical. Do we need to do it every day? Do we need to always do it while exercising in the heat? Can we do it post-exercise? Can we do it every other day? And with that kind of the body of literature has kind of opened up, which is very good. It also makes it a bit hard sometimes to figure out what it does and what it doesn't do. And like anything, there's going to be evidence for and against. So I guess it's just taking a bit of a fine comb and looking, okay, for my purposes, I am a runner or a cyclist and I do this distance. Then how much do I potentially need to do, for how long, and what kind of benefits may I expect? And then I think instead of just kind of not assuming, but just going for heat acclimation in general will be good for me. I think it's maybe there's enough evidence at least to try and at least look at certain parameters and try to see, okay, for my specific scenario, is there any evidence that it could potentially work?
So recovery versus additional stress. Maybe that's an interesting. Well, let's take a step back. Let's talk temperatures. So for the person that's looking for general health benefits, oftentimes you don't have a choice. You're at a rec center, you're at a health club. It is whatever temperature it is whatever humidity it is. But if you had a perfect world and you could set those things, what do we know any sense of this is the optimal temperature? And then does that vary for men versus women?
Yeah, so as far as I know, we haven't started looking at the optimal temperature within a given modality. So what studies have done is comparing different modalities. So for example, hot water immersion versus infrared sauna versus traditional dry Finnish sauna. I guess in the end, what matters is to cause a physiological response and is to try and really induce the heat adaptation process. And that the optimal temperature will vary mostly depending on whether it's air or water. And based on that, then that might affect the duration of which we need to expose ourselves. And I think most of the research that's been done has probably been hot water immersion and traditional dry Finnish sauna. And I guess the optimal temperatures for now would be the ones that are usually associated with those methods. So for hot water immersion, we probably want to be around, the 40 degrees Celsius range. That's usually what's going to get us pretty hot within more or less 30 minutes of almost whole body immersion. So let's say up until the neck level. And then for the traditional Finnish sauna, what's temperatures that are around 80 to 100 degrees Celsius. And I think those temperatures are probably good because we reach a point where we need to balance tolerance. So actually being able to tolerate it and being able to stay, especially in the sauna, for, at least 10 to 20 minutes where the body is really reacting to that stimulus and actually creating a physiological response. It doesn't mean that we couldn't go hotter, but I think it would be probably difficult to tolerate, and we just wouldn't be able to potentially stay as long because it would just be very uncomfortable.
And I was trying to do some conversions so I can share them with our listeners who are Fahrenheit oriented. The 80 degrees Celsius is 175 Fahrenheit. What was the high end? Did you say 100 or 95?
100. Yeah, 100 degrees
So that's 212.
Celsius.
So that's a pretty big range, 175 to 212. Yeah. Are we assuming the sweet spot somewhere there in the middle in the 185 to 190 range? Are there benefits lower?
I think if we had perfect control over it, and especially if we're naive to it, if we think of more of a health and wellness perspective, what would be potentially prudent would be to start at a lower temperature, let's say more closer to, let's say, the 80 degrees Celsius range, and then stay there for a good 10 minutes-ish, 10 to 15 minutes. And as we feel like we're tolerating it better, then we can start increasing temperature. And then eventually when we reach the sweet zone between 90 to 100 degrees Celsius, then we could start playing with duration as well. So just to give one example, so for example, where we're in a fitness facility, but it's also the cardiovascular prevention center of the Heart Institute, to which we're affiliated. And within the locker rooms, we have traditional dry Finnish saunas. And we don't have perfect control, but they stay at about an average of 90 degrees Celsius. So that's right in the middle of the range we were talking about earlier. And we've used that on people who never did sauna before, mostly older, so around a mean age of 70 years, and people who have heart disease. And in general, everybody's been able. And what we did is we played with duration, especially because we couldn't really control temperature to that with very much precision. And people started off with 10 minutes at a time, take a little break and a quick cold shower, go back in for 10 minutes. And over the span of about 4 to 5 weeks, we were able to increase them to 2 bouts of 15 minutes each. So they would get a 30-minute exposure. And everybody was able to progress in that way, just like we would progress through any exercise training program. So I think we can apply those same principles to, especially, again, if we've never used it, to maybe start a bit slow, just kind of get a feel for it, get used to it. And then we probably want to aim for, and again, for sauna, where we have a temperature where we're comfortable staying there for 15 to 20 minutes at a time, come out for a quick break, and then being able to go back in for potentially a second, or, if we're really motivated and have the time for 2, 3, 4 bouts, whatever it might be.
So you're looking at 2 times 15 being more beneficial than a 1 times 25 or something.
Yeah, and I think that was mostly from a tolerance side of things. So especially if when we haven't used sauna at first, when we go in, obviously it can feel a bit intense. It's very hot. And we would just break it up so that people could get a little bit of a reprieve. And we would let them take a 30-second shower. The showers are right next to the sauna. They would just kind of douse themselves. And then it would really help them with the perception, especially of the second bout. And what's nice with that is that the dowsing, so the quick shower, it helps kind of play with our skin temperature a little bit. It'll decrease it. But all the internal physiological responses are not really affected because it's very quick. So we have the perception of feeling a bit cooler, and we feel like we can tolerate a second one without affecting or compromising too much the physiological responses. So internal body temperature keeps going up. Our heart rate stays, a bit elevated. So that was really our reasoning behind that. On top of the fact that, in general practice, usually, especially Finnish sauna is used kind of mixed or contrasted with some sort of cold stimulus as well.
All right. So several questions out of that. So humidity, we're talking about traditional Finnish. We're using the word dry saunas, folks, but that also involves the rocks that you splatter some water on. So any sense of what the humidity percentage is with your testing?
Yeah, so for ours, it's very low because it's an electric heater. So and actually, we've had problems of people putting water on it and breaking it.
Okay.
So then when we move to more of a humid type of sauna, then we need to decrease the air temperature because it would just become it wouldn't be tolerable for a very long time because, so if it's dry but very hot, we're gaining heat from the very hot air, but our body is producing sweat and that sweat is able to evaporate. So we're going to be able to get hot, but not excessively hot within 10 to 20 minutes or whatever it might be. But as soon as we start making the room humid, we're kind of blocking that evaporation process. And now the sweat is produced, but it's not evaporating.
Right.
And we wouldn't be able to stay there for too long before we'd reach temperatures that could be potentially uncomfortable first, and then second, potentially dangerous. So that's why usually the humid saunas the temperatures are a bit lower. And we try to get to the same endpoint of, increasing our body temperature, increasing our blood circulation, creating physiological responses, but through different means, basically by blocking the process of sweat evaporation when it's humid, and then when it's very, very hot, it's just that the air is so hot that we're gonna store heat from the hot air.
Gotcha. So the 195, if we're calling that the sweet spot, that's almost zero humidity. You would reduce that down as you're adding humidity. So that might be 170, 175, 180, something around that range, depending on frequency and amount of humidity in the room. Am I hearing that correctly?
Exactly. Yeah. And especially, a good rule of thumb would be to just go by perception. So if I think in in a humid environment, it's going to feel much hotter because we're just going to feel that sweat accumulate on our skin. And maybe if we decrease the temperature, we just have to be careful with the duration. So maybe it's a bit of trial and error, but let's say if we didn't change temperature and we made it humid, then we would need to just decrease our exposure time, because probably within less time we would become more uncomfortable and less able to tolerate it. So if we want to try and maintain our exposure duration, then for sure we have to start decreasing the air temperature.
So the subjective response, you're sitting in there, you're not exactly sure what the humidity is or the heat for this example. You literally, to the point where you're like, yeah, I think it's time to step out. That's literally the time to step out. And then if you want to do a second dose with similar settings, that's where, but the subjective response, you're saying there's not this is optimal for women, this is optimal for men, this is optimal for a 25-year-old, this is optimal for a 75-year-old. It's really that subjective perception that we're looking for. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I think that would be accurate for now. So we don't have those hard numbers of like, you are this type of person, you should do X minutes in whatever type of sauna. I think it's safer to start with the perceptual component, because obviously, and when we need to be careful, because obviously if we're never used to the heat, as soon as we're going to go in, we're going to be like, okay, it's hot. Well, obviously,
I'm out.
So I'm out. That's it. Which is fine if we hate it, but if we're willing to tolerate it a little bit, we need to get past that initial discomfort. And then we'll get to a point where we're like, okay, it's maybe not 100% great, but I feel like I can tolerate it. And then if that changes, where it's like, oof, okay, I'm sweating a lot, I feel like my heart is racing a little bit. If we have some sort of doubt, then yes, that's when we should step out. We can do a quick shower, dowsing, whatever we might have access to, take a little break, and then try to go back in for a second bout if we feel like it. And as we do that, we're going to basically get better and better. And then we can increase either our initial duration. We could reduce the break that we take in between. We could start playing with temperatures and humidity. But I think if we start with perception, basically what we want at first is, again, if we're naive to it, is just to better tolerate heat exposure. And if we're able to tolerate it, we'll be able to stay there longer and have a stimulus that becomes interesting to potentially induce the adaptations we were discussing earlier about heat acclimation.
So you mentioned a lot of your studies, or the one that you were talking about, is with 70-year-olds. What were you looking for in terms of the response to this new stressor, if you will?
Yeah, so for that one, we were motivated by a study that was published around the mid-2010s, if I remember correctly, 2014, 2015. It was a study from a Finnish group, so in Finland. They studied approximately 2,300 middle-aged men. So I think it's important to clarify that this is only specific to men. And they basically asked them a questionnaire at the start of the study, and they said, okay, how many times per week do you use the sauna, and for how long? And keeping in mind that in Finland, pretty much everybody has a sauna and everybody uses it. So they stratified people, they separated them into different groups. Their control group were people who used the sauna one time per week, because they just didn't have anybody, I guess, that never used it.
Yeah.
And then they had a group that used it 2 to 3 times per week, and then 4+ per week. And then they just observed them. They looked over a period of 20 to 25 years. And what they saw is that the people who used the sauna 2 to 3 times per week were less at risk of cardiovascular mortality compared to 1 time per week. And the risk was even further reduced if people used it more than 4 times per week. And a very similar relationship was observed with duration. And the sweet spot for duration was around 15 to 20 minutes, let's say. So we really started, and so to back up one more.
One other clarification for listeners who are saying, well, wait a minute, that's correlation, causation. So they did peel out financial means and free time, if I remember the study correctly. So this was not, well, yeah, you benefit because you got all this time on your hands and you got all this money. It wasn't that. They peeled those out, if I remember correctly.
So they did, I think, as best as they could
Sure.
for that type of study design. So it does remain observational. They didn't say, okay, you're going to go in that group and you're going to go in that
Right.
group, and
Of
then we'll
course.
see what happens. But they did try to account for a lot of things. They measured their VO2 max. They considered their socioeconomic status. And they took a whole bunch of other
Yeah.
measurements to try and remove any confounding effect, to try
Right.
and isolate it to the fact that they're doing sauna more often than not.
Right.
So the only limitation with that type of study for all of those studies is that you can never be 100% sure that there's not something that's confounding your
Sure.
observation. And the other thing too is that they only asked them at one point of time, and then they followed them for 20 to 30 years, and they don't know how their habits changed
Right. Did
over
they
that
keep it
time.
up?
So,
Right.
so did they keep it up? Did they change? Would they have switched groups? So, but all that considered, it was very provocative because it said, okay,
Very.
is there something about sauna that's good? And us, from our perspective, was really, is there something about the heat exposure that's causing that relationship? So what we wanted to do was to more study the effects of sauna and try to isolate the effect of heat exposure, and to try and measure some physiological markers that were changing that could then explain those associations that were observed in that study. So what we did is we recruited, it was middle-aged to older adults, and in the end, they had a mean age of about 70 years with heart disease.
Mm.
And we randomized them. So, it was random allocation to either you're going to do sauna or just continue going on about your normal routine. We did that for 8 weeks. And the people who were randomized to the sauna intervention, they did sauna 4 times per week. And we started with 2 times 10 minutes with the quick shower in between. And we progressed them within roughly the first 4 or 5 weeks to 2 times 15 minutes. And all
With the
that was
temperature
kind of,
held constant.
yeah,
Okay.
exactly. With the temperature held constant at, about that sweet zone of,
195.
of 195. These were people who did not necessarily have previous experience with sauna. So our reasoning for how we did it was to try and align ourselves as best as we could with that Finnish study that showed, at least 2 to 3 times per week, at least approximately 15 minutes. So we try to get people to that relatively quick, and then do a bit more if we could, just to make sure that the stimulus would be sufficient. We recruited people with heart disease because in that Finnish study, I think there was a relatively good proportion of participants who had heart disease.
Mm.
And there was just a lot of studies that had been done on, let's say, relatively healthy people, but we kind of took the stance of like, well, if there is going to be some sort of benefit, we'd expect it to be greater in people who are potentially less healthy. And our main measurement was a marker of blood vessel health. So it's called flow mediated dilation. We use an ultrasound device to look at the artery in the arm, so the brachial artery, and we look basically at what point is it reactive? Does it respond forcefully or not to blood flow? And the more reactive it is, the healthier it is, and that measure's been shown to kind of predict future cardiovascular risk. So we did that measurement before and after the 8-week intervention. And in contrast to our hypothesis, actually, the sauna did not do anything additional to just going about our normal routine on that marker of vascular health. We also measured blood pressure. That didn't change with the intervention. But what we did see is that we saw signs and evidence of heat acclimation while doing that intervention. And in the end, I think that was potentially the most interesting finding of it all, is that people who aren't used to sauna or heat exposure, we can reasonably get them to a point where we see the classical signs of heat acclimation, which is a reduced resting internal body temperature, as well as greater sweating when they were exposed to heat. We kind of moved on from that study now to say, okay, could we use potentially sauna to heat acclimate people who may be at health risks when it's hot outside, so when there's a heat wave. And we also moved into other studies where Right now, we're actually combining exercise training with post-exercise sauna, like we were discussing before, but in the context of a cardiac rehab program to try and maximize the benefits of cardiac rehab. So that's, I guess my thinking has shifted more towards not so much using it on its own, but trying to combine it with exercise, especially, and also trying to use it to kind of better tolerate heat exposure in general and minimize our risk when it's hot outside.
Well, and this is your expertise, but my sense is from talking to other guests, we've got a sliver of people that get all the attention that love the endurance stuff. So they're hammering it and they're like, yeah, bring it on. But the majority of the population is simply not getting enough physical activity. So if there's anything that we can say, oh, look, and we have a university nearby, and I'm very familiar with their program that's similar to what you're doing, and it's tough to get folks consistent over time. It's just a hard thing. There are other priorities in life. We know that. So this offers an extension. It's almost like you're adding some icing on the cake. You're getting the exercise, that's the cake. The sauna adds some icing that brings some additional benefits. Is that accurate from your perspective?
Yeah, and I think that's a fair view of things. And the way I see it is almost like it's kind of like a toolbox. The way I see it is if we can offer as many options as possible to people for them to be generally healthy and especially have a good well-being, then people can then pick and choose what works for them or not, right? And obviously we know that exercise is probably the best thing we can all do, but like you said, there are a lot of limitations and barriers. So I don't want to minimize that at all, right. But if we can identify other things that people can do and can find, some interest and they feel good doing it, then why not, right? And if we can also come to a point where we can combine it, so maybe people don't have time to go exercise for an hour, but maybe if they could do 15 to 20 minutes, do their sauna after because they like it, well, could that have at least the same benefits as the hour of exercise in itself? So I think we're at the stage where we kind of need to establish the potential physiological adaptations that are beneficial related to heat exposure. And once we do that, then we can say, okay, how much, how long do we need to combine it with exercise or not, for who? So yeah, I totally agree. And I think the key is that in general, there's very little negative side aspects of exposing ourselves to heat. Obviously, we need to do it with caution. If we're not used to it, we start slow. If we have any doubts, we ask our physician. But, it's not particularly any more dangerous than exercise, for example. And I think there is really, just like exercise, there's definitely a perceptual component to it. So that's a component that was not captured in that Finnish study, is there's something about going in the sauna and just taking time to just focus on ourselves, relax. And I just wonder if that's also part of we've talked a lot about physiology, but there's potentially a lot of we know that, stress in general is probably not the best thing for health. So if it's just a moment where we can kind of stop, rest, and relax a little bit, and hopefully get some physiological adaptations, then that's probably not going to hurt anybody, right?
And you're not bringing your phone in because you'll overheat the darn thing. So it finally gives you 30 minutes without your phone in your life. All right, so let's flip a little bit to the endurance athletes. Now, first one, you said you got to be careful. And I want to remind my endurance athlete friends, because the tendency is, all right, turn it up higher, bring it on. I can do 5 more degrees. That's not what we're trying to do. What rational thinking can you help us crazy people realize this is optimal? Hotter is not always better. Or maybe I'm wrong. Maybe hotter is better as long as subjectively you're not about to faint.
Yeah. So yeah, exactly. So I think the endurance athletes, what is in their favor is that as we exercise train, especially at high intensities, we do develop some sort of partial heat acclimation because we generate so much heat when we're exercising at very high intensities. So for sure, endurance athletes can tolerate longer than the 10 to 15 minutes we've been talking about. So in the studies, recruiting people that probably don't do post-exercise sauna, they were doing 30 minutes of sauna after exercise sessions. So that's probably, if we're talking about, a Finnish sauna that's very hot and dry. I mean, 30 minutes continuous, especially after an exercise session, that's a very good stimulus. And it might be hard to go beyond that. But again, I think it comes back down to perception. If we genuinely feel good and we're not trying to override our warning signals, then I think we're probably okay to keep going. And again, there's nothing wrong with just taking a quick break, very quick shower or dowsing and then going back in. At least it'll just help us kind of take a reassess. Okay, am I actually feeling good, and go back in. And we're not going to necessarily lose the potential adaptations that we have from the heating stimulus. And I would say that really, like, the studies have already probably used the most potent temperatures that we could potentially use, because we're very much in a stage of research where we want to put all the chances on our side to show an effect. So we use basically the hottest that is potentially tolerable and doable. So the 80 to 100 degrees Celsius, and if it's water, the 40 degrees Celsius water. I mean, I'm sure people could probably go higher, but I don't think there's a need to. We could just stay longer. We could do multiple bouts. I think that would probably do the trick.
I think your point about the break is really important, because I know for myself, I feel like, oh, I can't step out. I'll reset. And you're saying, no. You'll reset your mind, because you kind of clean the sweat off. You enhance that evaporation when you step back in, et cetera. But the internal happenings don't shift in 90 seconds when you step out, cool down a little bit subjectively, and then step back in. So I think that's very, very valuable. I've noticed for myself, and I don't think I'm making this up, that I'm sweating sooner. So I'm on a bike trainer a couple times a week. So that one's an easy one to look at the ground and see how wet it is at the same intensity. Is that just the body saying, oh, we can do this faster. We're more efficient. We're better at this. And if so, does it then decrease the electrolytes concentration in that sweat? So A, there's more sweat, but B, there's less electrolytes per droplet of sweat, or however we measure that. And then C, does that change the way you fuel during a race?
Yeah, all good questions. So for sure, an adaptation of heat acclimation in general is that our heat loss mechanisms are going to be activated faster. So that's a very good observation. So the body will start to sweat faster, and it will sweat more, and the sweat will be more dilute. So it'll be less concentrated in sodium, especially. Now, I think in terms of, like, does it change our rehydration strategy? It kind of depends on duration and the environment we're in. Obviously, if we sweat more, potentially we need to replace more fluid if we want to offset dehydration. This is not my field at all, but I know there's obviously a certain level of dehydration that we can tolerate, and that's probably not going to affect our performance. So I think we just need to verify if we're, even if we sweat more, for example, if before using a post-exercise sauna within our events, we're sweating and we get dehydrated by 1%, maybe if we sweat more, does it become 1.5% or 2%? Or I don't know, maybe somebody's very reactive and then all of a sudden it becomes 3%. Well, then maybe it's like, okay, 3% is too much that I'm willing to tolerate, so I should make sure I increase my fluid intake. And in terms of the electrolytes, it's also a balance between, obviously there's less electrolytes per gram of sweat that's being produced, but in the end, we're going to produce more grams of sweat in the end. So off the top of my head, actually, I think that's a very good question that we would just need to see, at what point does one contribute to the other. But I would tend to say that probably we could keep the same rehydration requirements that we have at the moment, and mostly just evaluate the amount of fluid that we're losing and just decide if that warrants increasing our requirements or not. Yeah. So, but yeah. So, and it'll help us to perform anyways, because if we start to sweat sooner and we sweat more, it means that our internal body temperature is going to go up less when we exercise. and that potentially could, push back the moment where we feel heat exhaustion and especially heat stroke, which is potentially very dangerous if we don't recognize it and treat it.
And I'm stretching back into my annals of physiology here, but it seems like I remember the core temperature is the first limiter of the body when you're running or cycling or triathlon. Am I remembering that correctly?
Yeah, well, I don't know if I wouldn't say that it's necessarily the first one, but it's definitely an important factor. So we know that especially elite endurance athletes, when they do their competitions, so for example, a marathon runner or something that's within the 2-hour range, they endure and tolerate very high internal body temperatures, anywhere from 39 to 40 degrees Celsius. And there's some reports of, actually documented reports of people being within the 41 to 42 degrees Celsius range. And for the general population, those are, especially above 40 degrees Celsius, those are temperatures that are associated with heat stroke. But endurance athletes have, over time, developed that tolerance to such high body temperatures, and they go on and do their event, and they don't even feel it. But we know that that's not the case for necessarily everybody. And in general, we don't want to necessarily be at those temperatures because they can be associated with especially heat exhaustion. So just, feeling like we can't continue, we're very fatigued, potentially dizzy, have nausea, sure. We can faint. And again, heat stroke, if ever we get there, I mean, that needs to be treated quickly because it's potentially deadly if we don't recognize it.
But this creates a buffer, though, because you're prior, and just to give everybody temperature, so 40 degrees is 104 Fahrenheit. So your body previously, if you're running 6-minute pace for a marathon, maybe hits 103, but as you learn to cool more effectively through this, maybe it only gets to 102.4. or something.
Exactly. So and
that's a massive change.
It's a very important change. And on top of that is that the increase in body temperature will be less, it'll be reduced, but the starting body temperature will also be lower. So we kind of have two factors that kind of give us more room to increase.
Interesting. And why is that? Why would it lower the starting point?
Yeah, so that's I think that's kind of an unresolved case of thermal physiology research that we just don't really know exactly why, but it's consistently observed. Like if we heat acclimate ourselves, actually the one of the main markers to determine whether our intervention worked in a research context is whether resting internal body temperature decreases. And that's usually the most consistent response that we see in most people when we put them through heat acclimation procedures. Is it something, at the brain level that kind of resets itself, or, it kind of tolerates a new resting body temperature as the normal? Is it also that we talked about earlier, our plasma volume expands, so we have more blood volume, so there's just more space for that heat to kind of distribute within the body, and maybe that gives us a lower resting body temperature? We don't know the answer for sure, but the thing that for sure we know is that then we're starting at a lower temperature, so it'll just take longer. We have more buffer room to get to temperatures that are potentially detrimental for performance and eventually dangerous for health.
Yeah, I remember a few Olympics ago, I don't remember what it was, but it was a very hot setting. And I remember the cyclists and the runners wearing those cooling vests for the exact purpose you're talking about, to lower that starting point. It's interesting because as we started talking, it felt like, yeah, maybe it's helpful, maybe it's not. And the more we're talking, the more I'm hearing, yeah, it's significant.
It's definitely helpful from a thermoregulatory perspective. So our internal body temperature, our sweating capacity are able to deal with heat, whether it's internally generated or it comes from outside. Where it's a bit less unsure is whether that'll translate into performance gains. So are we actually going to do our performance quicker, faster? Is our VO2 max going to increase or not? I think that's where it becomes a bit muddier, and at least from a scientific literature point of view. But the physiological adaptations, those are for sure happening.
And you just jumped into a question I jotted down to ask you, the VO2 max. Have we studied that at all yet? And 6 weeks probably wouldn't be long enough, but where they're using sauna for 3, 4, 5, 6 months and then rechecking VO2 max with a constant training program?
So it's funny that the timing is good. There's actually been 2 systematic reviews with meta-analyses. So basically papers that went out and tried to identify every single study that had used sauna after exercise to look at things like changes in VO2 max, time trial performance. And then what they do is they use strict criteria to include or not the studies, and then they put them all together and they say, okay, what's the net effect of the whole literature, which is much stronger than any single study. And for now, there's very few studies. I think each one found about 10 studies maybe that have looked at it. And so far, the evidence is inconclusive as to whether it changes things like VO2 max, time trial performance. But again, within the limitations of testing that in a lab setting. So, can we fully recreate what is happening in an actual performance setting? That is obviously a limitation of lab studies. But for now, when we start specifically of post-exercise sauna exposure, it's inconclusive whether it'll actually change things like VO2 max or time trial performance. What's interesting is that earlier studies had used hot water immersion or exercising in the heat. And some studies did show that there could be improvements. Is it something related to sauna specifically versus hot water immersion that's different? Is it because, studies haven't done it for long enough? They haven't done the sauna duration to a point where it could add potential benefits to VO2 max? I think there's just a lot more research that needs to be done before we can have some clear answers.
It'll be interesting to see that come about. This is just an N of 1, obviously, but I went through a running injury, was out for 6 weeks, trained for a 5K I've done every year. So I have a really good baseline, and the weather was the same course, same everything. And on incredibly limited running, ran almost as fast as the previous year, only cycling a few days a week and using the sauna on a daily basis. There's a lot to that, a lot of potential co-founding variables and et cetera, et cetera. But it was interesting personally to see, it wasn't as fast. It was pretty close with almost no running in spite of. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see those come together in the years ahead. What about, I've got this question circled on the side here about using it for training enhancement or making the training harder versus recovery. Are there any guidelines along those pathways of, for example, I've been trying, when I want to make my workout harder, I'll spend 25, 30 minutes at 185. When I'm needing a little recovery, I'll still get in the sauna, but maybe it's 20 minutes at 170. Are there any guidelines about ranges to look for when you want recovery specifically? This is your athletes versus let's bring it up a notch, folks.
So in terms of specific guidelines, no. But I do think there is something so I think you could probably use the same parameters for both. It's just that if you use it to intensify your training session, then obviously it's just trying to do your normal training session, but in a hot environment. And I think what's nice about that one is it's very much playing on the perceptual side of things. So you're kind of training your body to tolerate a situation that's very uncomfortable, so that when you do it in a normal environment, let's say, or a non-hot environment, then maybe it won't feel as bad anymore, and you'll be more mentally resilient to pushing yourself in your normal environment. For the recovery side of things, I think you could probably just use the exact same parameters. It's just that then you're doing it after your exercise session. So it really comes down to whether you're going to do it during or after exercise. The only thing I would caution is that if people are using it during their exercise session, at least at first, we know that, exercise performance or output is going to decrease acutely because it's hot and we can't push as hard. But if we can kind of do that on a repeated basis, we should be able to regain our initial level. And that's when we'll really maximize our benefits, because then we're keeping the training stimulus that we want, but we're adding that additional layer of heat on top. So we just need to plan for that in our training to, at least exactly, and maybe taking a couple weeks to say, okay, maybe at first I'm going to accept that my training stimulus is not going to be as good, but then as I get used to it, I'm hoping that I'll get back to where I am before, and then I keep going with that afterwards.
Just a couple more. I really appreciate your time with this. As far as hydration, electrolyte balance, we talked about that briefly, but for folks using saunas, maybe for the first time in their life, should they be taking in extra fluid? Should they be taking in extra fluid with electrolytes? What are your thoughts along those lines? Or just go to taste still, or subjective need?
Yeah, so for people who are just doing it, let's say for health and well-being purposes, if they stay within the range of, let's say, 15 to 30 minutes, that would be separated into 1 or 2 bouts. There's probably no need to add electrolytes. I mean, we're obviously gonna sweat, but it's not an extreme amount that warrants replacing it with electrolytes. But for sure, they should just be mindful that they are sweating, and maybe they need to drink a little bit more. The easiest way is if they're in a fitness center and there's a scale available, just take body mass before and after, and then you know exactly what you've lost and what you need to replace. So it's not huge amounts either. So we don't need to drink 3 liters just because we did 15 minutes of sauna.
Right.
We can probably stick with a bottle of water, and that would be enough. So for general health and well-being purposes, we can probably drink to thirst. If we have access to a scale, measure before and after, and that'll give us a pretty good answer of how much we need to drink.
Okay. And so no need for them to add in some electrolytes of some sort. For the athlete, maybe if you're doing your bike and you're hopping right into the sauna, so you're adding sweating on top of sweating, maybe that group, or does the body balance itself out? And no, once you've been doing this a couple of weeks, the electrolytes rebalance.
Yeah, I think that would be an interesting one. I think it all depends in the end how much we get it through just our general nutritional intake, and whether that would be sufficient to offset what we're losing. But again, knowing that if we're heat adaptated, we have more dilute sweat, so it does decrease our requirements a little bit. I would say it becomes much more important when especially if we're performing in the heat. So if people are getting ready for a competition or a race that's going to be expected to be in a hot environment where we're going to sweat, a considerable amount for a considerable duration, then I think that's where it becomes most important. But I'm assuming that, most people would already have a plan in place to replace especially carbohydrates anyway. So most sports beverages have been, kind of designed to replace both the carbohydrate part, but also the electrolytes we could lose through sweat. So if they're already doing that, I would probably guess that it's probably sufficient. Okay. But if there's any doubt, maybe then it's a bit more focused evaluation on seeing, okay, how much is it that I'm potentially sweating, for how long, and does it justify increasing my intake a little bit more?
Okay. Last question. So you have a magic wand. You get to create the perfect world. And I'm going to ask you to take on 2 different roles. 1, health and well-being. 1, elite athlete. You get to design you have no time limitations. You have no restrictions on how other people set the sauna. How would you utilize the sauna in your life for health and well-being only? Not only, but health and well-being, if you had no restrictions on the way, the time, the frequency, etc.?
So I think, and it's going to be a relatively simple answer because it'll be the same for both contexts, so health and well-being and performance. In an ideal world, I would exercise first, and then I would use the sauna. I would use the sauna mostly as a kind of recovery, relaxation period afterwards. I would ideally get myself to a point where I could probably tolerate 20 to 30 minutes at a time in the sauna. And I would just go with the temperatures of a traditional Finnish sauna, so 80 to 100 degrees Celsius range. And what's nice is that doing that, it'll potentially maximize the benefits of exercise from a health and well-being perspective. But if we apply it also in a performance context, that's where most studies show benefits of heat acclimation, is doing it after our normal training routine. So I would do my normal training routine, try to optimize my performance that way, and then use post-exercise sauna as an additive, basically, to get the physiological adaptations associated with heat acclimation.
Sounds great. Dan, I really appreciate it. Great work. Keep it up. We'll stay in touch, because I think I'm sensing we're just scratching the surface, and what's going to come out in the next 5 to 7 years is going to be fascinating.
Absolutely. It'll be my pleasure. And thanks a lot for having me. It was really quite a lot of fun.
Yeah, I've been looking forward to that one for a long time. Glad we were able to get that teed up on the schedule. Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Coaching Lab podcast. If you've been considering pursuing your MBHWC approved coach certification, now's a great time. Each of our 4 annual cohorts includes the latest updates from the MBHWC, including a complimentary study group for those who are pursuing the national board exam. All the details on our Institute site, catalystcoachinginstitute.com, or email us anytime you want. results@catalystcoachinginstitute.com. We're happy to reply via email, or we can set up some time to talk about it. And you'll be talking to a coach or one of us, not some salesperson. And now it's time to be a catalyst. This is Catalyst Coaching's Dr. Brad Cooper. Make it a great rest of your week, and I'll speak with you soon on the next episode of the Coaching Lab podcast, or maybe over on the YouTube coaching channel.